So some claim that the Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of Daniel 8:14 and the 2300 evenings and mornings is not held by any other groups, so therefore it's false. Well, is that true? Well, depends on what qualifies as a group, for one. Contemporaneously or currently, there may not be any churches that officially hold a day for a year interpretation of the 2300 evenings and mornings, but what does history tell us about that? Some make bumptious claims about such things as if that's evidence for its falsity. And I'm going to read this article from a non-Seventh-day Adventist regarding this issue. So this is by Larry Wilson, who is not a Seventh-day Adventist. So this lengthy study, we're trying a new approach, which is to print the study in a booklet, blah, blah, blah. Let's see, let's jump ahead. Every student of prophecy wrestles with the meaning of Daniel's vision as it's described in Daniel 8. Daniel 8 is a difficult chapter to interpret. Several obstacles can thwart the intended meaning. A Bible student's presuppositions and the quirks of the Hebrew language make the context and concepts presented in Daniel 8 problematic. Even worse, some comments found in Daniel 8 appear on the surface to be disconnected from the main elements of the vision, the ram, goat, and horn power. Admittedly, Daniel 8 is a difficult prophecy, yet I find this vision to be a critical piece in the apocalyptic prophecy puzzle. The information revealed in Daniel 8 provides the key that connects several prophecies. In fact, without Daniel 8's contribution, certain mysteries within Daniel and Revelation would be impossible to solve. This is the interesting part to me to take note of here. After reviewing 66 prominent scholars who wrote explanations on prophecy between the years of AD 430 to 1781, it is interesting that few expositors say anything at all about Daniel 8, emphasizing the difficulty of it probably. Among these expositors, no consensus on the meaning of Daniel 8 exists, especially the 2300 days mentioned in verse 14 of chapter 8. Notice their conclusions written over a 1351 years as summarized. 1. So of the 66 scholars analyzed here that wrote on prophecy between those years, there's one group that said the 2300 days represent years, like Daniel 9. Out of the 66 surveyed, 21 took this view. This is the Seventh-day Adventist view. 21 of the 66. The 2300 days are 2300 literal days. 3 out of 66. The 2300 days reach to the end of the world. 6 that said that much, which would be partially agreed with Adventist interpretation, probably because of Daniel 12. The 2300 days represent 1,150 24-hour days. One writer. No comment on the 2300 days. Of the 66, 35 didn't say anything, even though they did write on prophecy. So that means 31 of the 66 surveyed mention it. 21 out of the 35, that's 60% of those who wrote on it. 60% of those who wrote on it took the Adventist view of so much as them representing a day for a year principle that was applied because of Daniel 9 being everyone agreeing on that much being a day equaling a year. Less than 10% took it literal. Less than 20% agreed that it went down to the end of the world at least. And a whopping less than 3% took the Chris Lucas view, or the 2300 days represent half as many 24-hour periods. For this survey, I purposely selected writers who wrote before the beginning of the 19th century, when Baptist evangelist William Miller and many others, both in Europe and the United States, began teaching that the 2300 days would end during the 19th century. It is important to note that before the 19th century, there was no consensus position on the meaning of Daniel 8. In fact, very little has ever been written on Daniel 8 during the past 2 millenniums. But those who did, 60%, took it as a day for a year. Historically speaking, William Miller was among the first to bring Daniel 8:14 out of obscurity during the time period of 1831 to 1844. So notice all those surveyed in the history of the church were only those separated from the Miller movement. So none of the people involved with the movement, which is known as the Great Disappointment, were included. So excluding those associated with the Great Disappointment were not considered in this survey. So, conclusion: the day for a year principle is absolutely historically orthodox, if you will, and should not be discarded as simply some obscure idea to try to bolster false doctrine or some nonsense like that. Another interesting point would be that the fact that if you don't attach the 2300 days, as is present in the Hebrew language when you understand the word provision is not simply one single word throughout Daniel 8 and 9, it becomes clear that it's very much associated with the 490-year vision, and therefore gives it a starting point and connections to what's comes at the end of the prophecy and where it begins suddenly come out of obscurity and make sense and dovetail nicely with what is said about the vision regarding the 2300 evenings and mornings and its understanding in the time of the end. Hey, Slam. How you doing? Good to see you. I'm going to try to make more of those highlights of Chris kicking butt and taking names. I want to do what I can to support the truth of what his ministry is contributing. I'd like to see him get a lot more credit than he does. Although he is building steam. I think that in the end, Chris will be remembered as a great contributor to the truth of conditional immortality and the character of God, if you ask me, although I know he's not as concerned with that. I want to make a video about if any view ought to receive, and I know Chris is not about that, but it's like some of the flack you get from people, and it's just like, I want to see if there was ever a doctrine that should be disdained by those who know God, it would be that God tortures people forever. I'm sorry. It's like a forgivable thing, and I love a lot of people that believe that, but I don't think they're using their mind very much when they just presume that. Especially Protestants who are supposed to be sola scriptura, But there's such a dearth of bad interpretation of apocalyptic literature. And it's difficult, obviously, and I've been studying it for a long time now. And that, if you watch that whole clip from a year ago with Stratton and Chris, and I liked Tim Stratton, by the way. But I agree with most of what he says. I wish more of them would come off the fence. I know it's like a safe position, and I just wish more people would stand up, get take a positive stance on it. But what Chris says in that video, anyways, what Chris says in that full interview regarding the most difficult passage for for the view, the true view, was just amazingly good. When he describes the issue of interpretation of Revelation, and then like how essentially like overly literal approaches have totally just stained the minds of people who hear it. They just they think they can take the apocalyptic literature and then make it inform the more historical narrative of, say, like Ezekiel 28, or just the general sense of God's promise to destroy sin and wickedness for good. That's like one of the greatest things about our God, is that he is going to end suffering and death and sin, not sustain it forever. And to think that you can take apocalyptic symbolism, and he makes a point in there too, where it's like, look, we got this thing from Daniel and this thing in Revelation that seem to give you two different outcomes, but they're talking about the same thing, and that is the destruction of the beast system. To think like the New Testament is going to like correct the Old Testament is so problematic. So it's like, but then when you have if you watch that and you listen really carefully, it's just like, if people really listen, it's like you ought to get an epiphany and realize about symbolic language there and how it works. It should strike you, and then all of a sudden that caution and Revelation says forever and ever, and they'll be tormented forever, and therefore I'm going to take that as if it has prominence over the Old Testament, like it's some other God. But once you realize you can't put the Bible against itself, and then you realize the nature of interpreting that kind of literature, suddenly it feels like, at least for me, like I already believed it, but when he made the point the way he does, and it is just tremendously just on point. I might make another clip of that. But anyways, I hope you're well. God bless.